Good morning. This is Mr. Reed. I'm coming to you here this morning to tell you where we're going to go with our entire study of American history and to give you a little bit of a heads up of where we're going to start in particular with our first unit of study. So, what you're looking at there is basically our timeline for the year. 8 different units, not all of them are of the same size and importance. So let me just run down the list for you here really quickly. We'll start with foundations. I'm going to tell you what that's about here in just a few minutes. Some real basic stuff. Number 2 will be on our first real study of American history is a Civil War Reconstruction and Westward Expansion unit. So we go back and we look at a little bit of the causes of the Civil War, how the war is fought, in particular to look at how, what were we trying to accomplish with that war? What was the U.S. going through? And look at the attempts to actually accomplish those goals with Reconstruction. And while that's occurring, the United States is also becoming a grown-up nation going, spreading from coast to coast. So we'll look at westward expansion during that same time period. Unit 3, the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, is really about how the United States grows up as an industrial power, how the United States becomes a much more urban country than what it was before. We'll look at some of the problems that are created, the pluses and the minuses that come out of that, and some of the attempts to try and maybe fix some of the problems that are created with that during that time period. So that'll be our third unit of study. Unit 4, imperialism and World War I. We'll look at how the United States enters into the world stage, and we'll look at its graduation as a world power with World War I. That takes us through about 1920, and that's usually about where we get by the end of the first semester. There might be some wiggle room, movement one way or the other, but that's about where we aim to be at the end of the first semester. Then when we come back, we'll be looking at the 1920s, how that was generally good times for the United States, but how there are some underlying problems that show themselves with the Great Depression of the 1930s. And then after that, we look at the biggest war that humans have ever been involved in, World War II, and what the United States' role in that was, and how that then leads into another conflict the United States gets into that lasts for 45 years. We'll look at the Cold War and some hot wars within the Cold War. We then step back in time a little bit and do some stuff that overlaps. We'll look at social changes of the 1950s and the 1960s with a particular emphasis on the civil rights movement and the sea change that occurred there. And then our last unit of study is post-Cold War, move towards the turn of the century and getting as close to today as we possibly can. So that's our whole overview of the entire year. So let me just tell you a little bit about this first unit of study. We just called it Foundations. These are the things that we talk about over and over again, and we just found in years past that students did a lot better if we kind of ran through some of this stuff. So we look at geography, some of the terminology that we're going to focus on, governmental structures. You'll have government class next year, but we just want to make sure that when we talk about the president signing a bill, what does that actually mean? Congress passes a law, but what happens there? Does that make it the law of the land? Those kinds of basics. And then we'll look at some economics and enough to be able to study American history and figure out what's the country trying to do to get out of, say a recession. How does that work? And how if people are interested in a different economic system, what do those terms mean? So geography, our particular emphasis is going to be on things like regions of the country. If I say somebody moved to the west, what is that? What do you picture in your mind? Are there mountains in the west? That kind of, so just a quick kind of basic review of geography. Again, with the government, we'll look at things like governmental structures, the 3 branches of government, the separation of powers, federalism, what does it mean to have a federal government and state governments? And again, then some real basic economics with different review really of what you did in world history. Some comparative economic systems. What's the difference between capitalism and socialism? And so we'll only spend about a week and a half, 2 weeks on those things. Things that most of that's going to be a review of things that you've already known. So that's where we're going as we start the year.